Have you ever wondered why some of the most extraordinary stories never make it into the history books? Welcome to 7 Continents, One Story.
So glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, this is literally my favorite place to be. Let's go.
I'm Celine, based in Edinburgh, Scotland. History hobbyist, library regular, endlessly curious.
I'm Niels, professor of history from Sweden. I've spent decades collecting these stories.
And I'm Ethan from Malta. I'm the one who always asks what happened in Japan.
Each episode, we travel together through time, across all 7 continents, to uncover a story that shaped the world.
We bring the history. Celine brings the questions that make you think differently about it.
And I bring the questions that make Niels slightly nervous.
The more we learn, the more we realize how much there still is to discover.
Right, Niels, I have a proposition for you. Oh no. Last time you had a proposition for me, we spent 2 hours arguing about whether the Scottish Highlands were strategically defendable.
Wait, was there a correct answer? Because I have a documentary about medieval fortifications and...
Ethan, let's get through this one first. Niels, €5 says you cannot identify what I'm holding. Now, you've got my attention. What is it? It's parchment. Old parchment. Really old. Covered in Latin script that spirals across the page in tight, formal medieval handwriting. And here's what fascinates me. This single document, held in a museum in London, changed absolutely everything about how we understand power itself.
Is this one of those mystery artifacts? Because I'm terrible at guessing these, but I love them.
You want €5 from me, so it must be something I should know about.
All right, let me paint you a picture. Picture a meadow beside a river. The year is 1215. It's June, and a king, frightened, desperate, militarily outmatched, is about to do something that has never been done before in the entire history of European monarchy.
A king doing something unprecedented? That's so cool. What happened?
That's what the parchment tells us. But first, we have to understand how we got here. We have to understand a man named King John, and we have to understand desperation.
All right, Celine, I'm completely hooked. Take us there. Let me take you there. The year is 1215. You're in England. But this isn't the England you might imagine. This England is ruled by a king from Normandy, a French-speaking king who most of his nobles don't trust.
Wait, France and England had the same king?
Brilliant question, Ethan. Yes. You see, in 1199, a man named King Richard the Lionheart dies. He's the king of England, but he also holds vast territories in France. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, all of these are his to rule. But when Richard dies, his youngest brother takes the throne. A brother nicknamed Lackland because he was supposed to get almost nothing.
That's a rather cruel nickname.
It was, and it might have been prophetic, because this youngest brother, now crowned King John, was about to lose everything.
What do you mean, everything?
In 1202, King Philip Augustus of France invades Normandy. John tries to defend it. He fails. By 1206, the greatest treasures of the English crown, Normandy, Anjou, the heartland of the Angevin Empire, all of it is gone, lost to the French. The king's military reputation is destroyed.
And if you're a king who's just lost all your wealth and prestige, you need money fast.
Exactly right, Celine. And that is when King John makes a decision that will define his reign. He decides to squeeze every last pound out of his English nobles.
How does a king squeeze his nobles?
Feudal incidents, taxes, fees that he claims are his by right.
Precisely. You see, in feudal England, a king had certain rights. He could demand scutage, a tax that nobles paid to avoid military service. He could exploit wardships. When a noble died and his heir was underage, the king got to manage the lands and collect all the profits until the heir came of age. He could arrange marriages for widows, collecting fees from their new husbands. But King John didn't just use these rights. He abused them viciously.
He took widows' lands?
He took widows' lands and forced them to marry men of his choosing. He charged reliefs so enormous that families were bankrupted just to inherit their own estates. He levied scutages, these military taxes, at rates that were simply unconscionable. Normally, a knight might pay 1 mark per knight's fee. Under John, it was 2 marks, then 3 marks. In 1214, he demanded 3 marks per knight's fee to finance a military campaign to recover his lost French territories.
But didn't the nobles have to pay?
That's the beautiful part, Ethan. Eventually, they said no. They decided they would not be squeezed anymore.
And how did that conversation go?
That conversation took place in January of 1215. A group of barons, maybe 40 of them, met with the king in London, and they presented him with a list of demands. They wanted these feudal abuses to stop. They wanted the king to govern by law, not by arbitrary whim.
Was there a particular moment that made them finally say no?
Yes. In July of 1214, John had assembled what he thought was a grand army. He wanted to invade France and recover his lost lands. He marched to a place called Bouvines, and there, his allies were utterly defeated. His hopes of military recovery were destroyed, and all those nobles who had paid those enormous scutages, they had paid for a failure. They had paid to lose. They were finished being patient.
So when they came to him in January with their demands,
He refused them. He said no. He offered minor concessions, but nothing substantial. And the barons realized something crucial. They realized that King John would never willingly limit his own power. So they stopped asking.
What did they do instead?
In May of 1215, something remarkable happened. At a place called Northampton, the barons renounced their feudal oaths. They formally declared they were no longer loyal to King John. And then they seized the city of London. On the 17th of May, they took control of the kingdom's capital. For the first time, the king faced a real military threat from his own nobles. For the first time, he had nowhere to run.
so that's when the negotiation actually happened.
That is precisely when the negotiation actually happened. The king was forced to the table, and all of this brings us to a meadow. A meadow beside a river, a place called Runnymede.
Is that where the parchment comes in?
That is exactly where the parchment comes in. Because between the 10th and the 15th of June, 1215, something extraordinary occurred in that meadow. A document was negotiated. A document that would establish for the first time in European history that even a king must obey the law.
The Magna Carta.
The Magna Carta. Now, before we get to the actual sealing, we need to understand one crucial person, because this document didn't emerge from a vacuum. It emerged because of one man who served as a bridge between a desperate king and furious barons. This man's name was Stephen Langton. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
The head of the church in England?
Exactly right. But here's what makes Stephen Langton so fascinating. He wasn't born in England. He was educated at the University of Paris, where he studied theology and became one of the greatest biblical scholars of his age. And during his time at Paris, he had access to something remarkable. He had access to old documents, old charters. And one of those documents was something called the Charter of Liberties, written 100 years earlier by King Henry I.
So there was precedent for a king limiting his own power?
There was a precedent, but the Charter of Henry I lacked one crucial element. It had no enforcement mechanism. If the king agreed to it and then violated it, there was no way to compel him to obey. It was just a promise, and promises can be broken.
So Stephen Langton realized that the new charter would need, what, something to make the king actually follow through?
Not just something, everything. The whole structure would need to be different, and that is where Stephen Langton became crucial.
What exactly did he do?
From what historians can piece together, Stephen Langton met with sympathetic barons and revealed to them what he knew about the Charter of Henry I. He proposed that they use it as a foundation, but he also helped them organize their demands in a new way. The barons had grievances, specific feudal grievances, but Stephen Langton helped them transform those grievances into something broader, something that spoke to fundamental principles of law and justice.
Like what kinds of principles?
The principle that the king cannot simply seize lands without trial, the principle that justice cannot be sold to the highest bidder, the principle that if the king taxes his subjects, he must have their consent. And most revolutionary of all, the principle that if the king violates these rules, he can be compelled to obey them.
That's genuinely revolutionary, isn't it?
Celine, you are describing perhaps the most radical idea in the entire history of European monarchy. For 1,000 years, from Rome to this moment in 1215, European kings had claimed to rule by divine right. The notion was that the king answered to God alone. His power was absolute. He was above the law. And here, in this meadow in England, someone is about to write a document that says, no, the king must obey the law. The king is not above the law.
That's so cool. So what happened?
So between June 10th and June 15th, the negotiation intensified. The barons had brought with them a list of their specific demands. Historians now call it the Articles of the Barons. But these articles were rough. They were a list of complaints. Stop taking wardships. Stop forcing widow remarriage. Stop charging excessive reliefs. But Stephen Langton did something remarkable. He took those raw demands and he transformed them. He organized them. He elevated them. He reworded them into legal clauses. He created a document that was both specific about current abuses and universal in its principles.
So he was rewriting their demands?
More accurately, he was refining them, elevating them, making them legal, making them permanent, making them something that could be enforced.
And the king just agreed to all of this?
The king was facing military defeat and the loss of his throne. He had very little choice. On June 15, 1215, King John traveled to Runnymede. He sat in the meadow with the barons who had demanded these changes, and he affixed his great seal to a parchment that contained 63 clauses, 63 promises that he would govern differently.
His great seal. So it was official. It was real.
It was real. The first time in English history, perhaps the first time in European history, a ruling monarch had been forced to commit in writing to limitations on his own power. On June 19th, the barons renewed their oaths of loyalty. For a moment, just a moment, there was peace.
Why do I feel like this story is about to go very badly?
Because it does. Within weeks, everything fell apart.
The king never intended to honor it, did he?
No, he didn't. Historians agree on this point. King John sealed the charter not because he believed in limited monarchy. He sealed it because he was militarily outmatched and needed time. And as soon as he was back in positions of power, even slightly, he began working to have the document annulled.
Annulled by who?
By the one authority that even kings deferred to, by the Pope. Here's the situation in late June of 1215. The charter is sealed. The barons have renewed their oaths, but King John knows something the barons don't. He knows that he is not actually their feudal lord by his own will alone. He is answerable to a higher authority. In 1213, he made a desperate deal with Pope Innocent III. He agreed to make England a papal fief, to place his kingdom under the Pope's direct authority in exchange for papal support against the barons.
He made his own country the Pope's property?
He did, as a desperate political maneuver, and this means something crucial. If the Pope declares the charter invalid, then the charter becomes invalid. The entire thing falls apart, and John has allies in the highest place possible.
So did he ask the Pope to annul it?
You know, speaking of long-term strategy, this actually reminds me why we're partnered with Cyprus Real Returns.
Right, because smart investing has always been about finding stable, secure opportunities.
Exactly. Cyprus Real Returns offers secure real estate investments with guaranteed 6 to 12% returns, fully backed by the Cyprus Land Registry. Professional management makes it completely hands-off.
And with Cyprus tourism booming, over 4 million visitors annually, those returns can fund your own historical adventures. Visit cyprusrealreturns.com.
That is our choose your own history moment. Imagine you are King John. You have sealed the Magna Carta. The barons have renewed their oaths, but you hate what you've done. You didn't want to limit your power. You had 3 choices. First, you could accept the charter and govern differently, limiting your own power, consulting the barons, respecting the law of the land. This would mean reforming yourself. It would mean accepting that monarchy means something new.
What was the second choice?
Second, you could attempt to renegotiate. Go back to the barons and try to strike a compromise. Try to convince them to give you back some of the powers they had restricted. Try to create a settlement that both sides could live with. And third, you could appeal to the Pope. You could convince the highest authority in Christendom that the Magna Carta was obtained by force, that it violated your rights as a divinely appointed king, that it should be annulled. You could ask the Pope to invalidate the entire document.
What would you do, Nils?
I would find the first option, accepting the charter and reforming, almost unbearable if I were a medieval king. The very idea that I was not above the law, that my power was limited, that I had to consult with my subjects. It would feel like a betrayal of everything I had been taught about monarchy.
But the second option, renegotiation, that seems like it might work.
Perhaps, if John had been a different man, if he had been willing to negotiate, to compromise, to accept that his power had changed forever. But he wasn't that man. King John was desperate, angry, and determined to recover his absolute power.
So he chose the third option?
He chose the third option. In late June of 1215, King John sent envoys to Pope Innocent III. He asked the Pope to annul the Magna Carta. He claimed the charter had been extracted by force. He claimed it violated his rights as a divinely appointed king. And on August 24th, 1215, barely 10 weeks after sealing the charter, the Pope responded.
What did he say?
Here are the Pope's exact words. The charter was, he said, not only shameful and demeaning, but also illegal and unjust. The Pope declared the Magna Carta to be null and void. He annulled the entire document, all 63 clauses erased.
So it was all for nothing?
Not for nothing, but certainly it seemed that way at the time. The moment the barons learned of the papal annulment, they knew that King John had been negotiating in bad faith. They knew that he had never intended to honor the charter. They knew that they would have to fight.
Civil war.
Civil war. The First Barons' War began in the autumn of 1215 and would continue until 1217. It was vicious, it was devastating, and it only ended with the death of King John.
How did he die?
In October of 1216, at a castle called Newark, King John died of dysentery. He was roughly 49 or 50 years old. And here is where the story takes a remarkable turn. With John gone, the barons faced a choice. His heir was a 9-year-old boy named Henry. If they continued fighting, they would be fighting against the child king. But if they accepted Henry, they could negotiate with his regent. And that regent was willing to do something remarkable.
They reissued the charter?
They reissued the charter, but not just once. The regency government for young Henry III reissued it in 1216. They modified it slightly and reissued it again in 1217. And finally, in 1225, when Henry came of age, he reissued it a third time. That 1225 version became the standard. It became the charter that would be reaffirmed again and again over the centuries. And here's what changed everything. When the charter was reissued in 1225, the church that had once annulled it, now enforced it. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop, pronounced excommunication against anyone who violated the charter's terms. Violation of the Magna Carta became an ecclesiastical matter. Violation carried the threat of damnation itself.
So the church that had helped the king annul it now helped enforce it?
The very same archbishop who had designed the charter in the first place, Stephen Langton, used his ecclesiastical authority to make the charter permanent. This was brilliant. By tying the charter to church authority, to the threat of excommunication, it became unchallengeable even by kings who hated it.
So Stephen Langton was really the hero of this story, wasn't he?
Celine, yes, and yet his name is barely remembered. Think about what we have just described. The barons wanted limitations on royal power. They had grievances, specific feudal grievances. They wanted to protect themselves from exploitation. But it was Stephen Langton who transformed those grievances into something universal. It was Stephen Langton who elevated baronial self-interest into constitutional principle.
What did he actually do?
He took the Articles of the Barons, a rough list of complaints, and he rewrote them. He clarified them. He expanded them. He added provisions protecting the church's freedom. That became Clause 1, and it reflected his particular interest. But then he did something remarkable. He thought beyond the current conflict. He thought about future conflicts. And he created language that, while addressed to feudal incidents of his time, contained principles that would outlast feudalism itself.
Give me an example.
Clause 39. Listen carefully to this language. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Think about what that sentence contains. It says no one, not even the king's will, but the law. It says by judgment of peers. It says by process. It says by law. These ideas seem simple to us now because they have become foundational to everything we believe about justice. But in 1215, when absolute monarchy was the norm, This was genuinely radical.
And this came from Stephen Langton?
The evidence suggests he wrote or substantially rewrote these clauses. And here's what fascinates me most. Stephen Langton didn't write the Magna Carta to create democracy. He wrote it to protect feudal property rights, the property of barons, and the rights of the church. But he wrote it in language that was universal enough to be adapted and reinterpreted by future generations. It's as if he planted seeds that would grow into something far larger than he could have imagined.
So he deserves to be remembered.
He absolutely deserves to be remembered. And yet, when people think of the Magna Carta, they think of King John sealing it. They think of the barons forcing their rights. They rarely think of the brilliant Archbishop who actually wrote it. Remember Stephen Langton. Remember that the greatest revolutions in human rights are often designed by people whose names are forgotten.
So how did this actually change the world?
All right. The immediate impact was disappointing. The charter was sealed in 1215. It was annulled in 1225. Civil war consumed the next few years. Most people would have thought it had failed. But here's the remarkable part. Each time the charter was reissued, it became more established. Each time a king confirmed it, it became more binding. Each time a parliament referenced it, it became more constitutional.
So the very fact that it failed, then was reissued again, that made it more powerful?
That is exactly right. By 1297, when King Edward I formally issued the 1225 version as part of English statute law, the Magna Carta had transformed. It was no longer just a feudal agreement. It was the foundation of English law. And from English law, it spread.
To where?
To America. When the American colonies were in conflict with Britain in the 1760s and 1770s, the colonists invoked the Magna Carta. They claimed it as an ancient right of Englishmen, even Englishmen living in America. When they wrote the American Constitution, they built it on principles that trace directly back to Clause 39 of the Magna Carta.
What principles?
The Fifth Amendment to the American Constitution says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Compare that to Clause 39 of the Magna Carta. "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by lawful judgment." The language is different, but the principle is identical. The idea is that even the government must follow law. Even the government cannot act arbitrarily.
So the Magna Carta is literally part of the foundation of the American Constitution?
Yes, and not just America. Every constitutional democracy in the world, whether explicitly or implicitly, rests on the principle that the Magna Carta established, the principle that law comes before power, that even the highest authority must obey the law.
And all of that comes from a desperate moment in a meadow in 1215, from a king who was trapped, from barons who were angry, from an archbishop who was brilliant.
From Stephen Langton, who knew that the only way to solve this crisis was not to create a victory for one side, but to create something that would constrain everyone, including himself, the church, the barons, and yes, even the king.
The king too?
Especially the king. Because the revolutionary moment of the Magna Carta is not that it protects the people from the king. The revolutionary moment is that it submits the king himself to law. It says, "You are a king, and we honor the monarchy, but you are not above the law of the land."
That's genuinely profound.
And yet, here's the surprising historical fact that still astounds me. The Magna Carta failed. It failed immediately. King John repudiated it. The Pope annulled it. Civil war broke out. And yet because it failed, because each generation of rulers had to reissue it, had to negotiate with it, had to eventually accept it, it became permanent. The very failure that made it seem worthless in 1215 made it unchallengeable by 1297.
So failure made it successful?
In a way, yes. Because with each reissue, with each confirmation, the charter absorbed more authority. It became more real. And by the time it was encoded into statute law, no king could ever remove it again. It had become constitutional bedrock.
And this is why we still talk about it 800 years later?
We talk about it because the principle it established, that law matters more than power, that even the mightiest authority must obey the law, that justice requires due process, is the foundation of everything we believe about good governance. It's not perfect. The original Magna Carta didn't protect common people. It didn't free slaves. It didn't guarantee equality. But it planted the idea, it planted the seed, and every subsequent expansion of rights to common people, to women, to all humans has roots that trace back to that moment in 1215 when a desperate archbishop convinced a desperate king to accept that he was not above the law.
All right. Earlier, I showed you the mystery. I showed you the parchment, the medieval Latin, the formal script, and I asked if you could identify it.
And we still haven't actually guessed what it was.
Here's the final clue. 4 copies of this document survive from the original 1215 sealing. 2 are held at the British Library in London. 1 is at Lincoln Cathedral. 1 is at Salisbury Cathedral. For 800 years, these 4 copies were scattered. Museums held them. Libraries held them. They were separated by distance and centuries. And then, in February of 2015, on the 800th anniversary of the Charter's sealing, all 4 were brought together for one day.
That's so cool. They all came together?
All 4 original copies in the same place for the first time in 800 years. This is the document we have been discussing. This is the Magna Carta, sealed by King John in 1215 with his great seal of wax. This is the parchment that changed the world. And when I was at the University of London, I had the privilege of holding a museum-quality replica of the original. And I can tell you, the moment your fingers touch that parchment, even a replica, and you read those medieval words, even if you don't speak Latin, you feel the weight of history. You feel the moment when someone decided that power itself must be limited by law.
It's a remarkable object.
It is, and it represents something remarkable. It represents the moment when human civilization took a step toward the idea that might does not make right. That law comes before power, and that even a king must obey.
So let's recap what we have just learned. In 1215, in a meadow called Runnymede, beside the Thames River in England, something unprecedented occurred. A king, frightened and militarily defeated, was forced to seal a document that limited his power. That document contained 63 clauses addressing feudal grievances. But embedded within those clauses were universal principles about law, justice, and the limits of power.
Principles that lasted because they were universal.
Principles that lasted because they were reissued, reaffirmed, and eventually embedded into the very foundation of English law. And from England, they spread to America. From America, they spread worldwide. Today, nearly every constitutional democracy, whether they explicitly cite the Magna Carta or not, rests on the principles it established.
And it all happened because a king wanted money and pushed his nobles too far.
And because those nobles pushed back. And because an archbishop saw an opportunity to transform a feudal dispute into a constitutional moment. History is often the product of desperate circumstances. But what we do with those circumstances, that's up to us.
And we have established that Stephen Langton did something remarkable with his circumstances.
He absolutely did. Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1215 to 1228. He was born in England or Normandy around 1150. He studied at Paris. He became the chief architect of the Magna Carta. He transformed baronial complaints into constitutional law, and he used ecclesiastical authority to make it unchallengeable. Remember Stephen Langton. Remember the name of the archbishop who convinced a king that he was not above the law. Remember that the greatest advances in human rights often come from people whose names are forgotten, but whose contributions shape civilization itself.
That's a good way to remember him.
History isn't what happened. History is who we remember, and we should remember Stephen Langton as the brilliant mediator, the patient drafter, the ecclesiastical authority who helped create the foundation upon which all of our modern freedoms rest.
That's a remarkable legacy. Until our next journey through time, keep history alive. Because the principles that Stephen Langton helped establish in 1215 are not historical artifacts. They are living ideas. They are what we have to defend, to maintain, and to extend to everyone, today, tomorrow, and in all the centuries to come.
That was so cool. Can we do an episode on constitutional development in Japan next?
We absolutely can, Nils. In fact, next week we are staying in Europe, but we are jumping forward in time. The year is 1347. A ship has just docked in Italy. It's carrying goods from the east, but it's also carrying something far more sinister. Something that will kill 1/3 of Europe and change civilization forever. the plague is coming, so join us next week for an episode you will not forget.
What a journey through history today. You know, one thing I love about studying the past is it teaches us to think strategically about the future. That's why I'm genuinely glad we're partnered with Cyprus Real Returns. They offer a strategic approach to building wealth, guaranteed 6 to 12% returns on Cyprus real estate, 100% secured through the Cyprus Land Registry with professional management handling everything. The goal? Financial freedom to experience the history we love. With Cyprus tourism booming and property values growing nearly 8% annually, it's an opportunity worth exploring. Visit cyprusrealreturns.com to learn more.
I have shivers already. See you next week on 7 Continents, One Story. Until then, keep history alive.